Everyone can hear me in the back, right? Do I need to speak louder? No. Yeah, all right. So what's going on in Venezuela? Yeah. So over the last few weeks, really, an extreme faction of the Venezuelan right wing has been waging war on the people of Venezuela. That's what's been going on in Venezuela. This war has been aimed really at destabilizing the country. People who have come out in support of the government, and the Venezuelan people have come out in mass, have been violently attacked. There are armed gangs barricading the streets, murdering government supporters, and causing such disruption that everyday life has become so dangerous, extremely dangerous, and even fatal for the Venezuelan people. The recent violence and attempt to undermine the Venezuelan government and incite a coup against the democratically elected President Nicolás Maduro, and that is the real intention of the right-wing opposition, to overthrow the government in Venezuela, needs to be viewed within the context of what is occurring on a global scale. I mean, of course, there are very important internal factors, and we'll discuss those, but as revolutionary socialists, we analyze things holistically, and we consider this struggle with a broader international perspective. And around the world, the class struggle is intensifying. We just saw a video of some, extreme violence in the Ukraine. Really around the world, the working class is reeling from a global capitalist crisis. This has been going on for years and years now, and we hear of this recovery that's supposed to trickle down to us that has not happened. And what is happening, though, is that the contradictions of capitalism in all their cruelty just become more and more apparent. The rich are reaping record profits, and we are struggling to survive. And in times like this, when we are struggling to survive, when capitalism is being exposed, the ruling class tightens its grip. The ruling class is always aware of the need to secure its position and quickly crush any act, or even a potential act, of defiance that can embolden workers around the world to fight back. So what we're seeing are manifestations of a global counter-revolutionary trend. Attempts to crush anti-imperialist and progressive movements of any form, anywhere. It's not limited to the overthrow of revolutionary governments, but targets any sector that defies the interests of Western imperialism. Most recently, we've seen the ratcheting up of imperialist attempts to overthrow the government of North Korea, where imperialism has launched a renewed offensive. Many of us may have heard of the new international attempt to undermine that government through a UN report advising that North Korean leaders be referred to the International Criminal Court at The Hague for torture and killings comparable to Nazi-era atrocities. And this report was recently cited favorably and endorsed by the New York Times, which really is just a sign that key ruling class sectors support this path, the referral of leaders to The Hague, which basically closes off any chance of diplomatic avenue, right, and heightens the potential for overt intervention in the DPRK. And there's also heightened potential for destabilization in the efforts coming from the South. The South Korean left is on the defensive. It has faced increasingly severe repression over the last year, and now there's been a recent conviction of a leader of the Unified Progressive Party for treason. Speaking out against your government, treason. Speaking in favor of the people, treason. Speaking with socialist designs, treason. So you can see that there really is just this new offensive in every way to attack any progressive movement. We've also just seen the video about the overthrow of the elected government in the Ukraine, which really was staged by the EU and the United States. The United States and the EU heavily support the coup d'etat, and now those aggressive interventionist forces are benefiting from this success, right? The success of these forces, of the people of the Ukraine. And while the US and Western imperialist governments have no qualms about declaring their support for what are truly ultra-right fascist forces, that's a really clear indication of which side they're on, the significance of these tendencies taking power is not lost on us as revolutionary socialists. Because in times of crisis, in times like this, without a revolutionary leadership, workers are vulnerable to fascist tendencies. But these uprisings are regressive. They're anti-worker. They're not revolutionary. And it's our responsibility to expose and fight back against these right-wing counter-revolutionary forces and trends, and also any support for them. And that's what we have to do for the right-wing counter-revolutionary violence being waged in Venezuela right now. Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution is unique. The leadership of the revolutionary process gained power through the electoral arena. There was no revolutionary overthrow of the old government, social order, or an economic system. This doesn't mean that the people of Venezuela have not come into motion and been critical actors in defending the government and the gains it has made towards socialism. In fact, it was the masses of people who came out in support of the revolution and defeated the 2002 coup that temporarily removed Hugo Chavez from office, a coup that was supported by U.S. imperialism, directly funded by the U.S. government. It was the masses who overthrew the resulting right-wing dictatorship that had suspended the Venezuelan constitution and secured the release and restoration of Hugo Chavez to the presidency. But the Bolivarian revolution is particularly susceptible to counter-revolution because these right-wing forces retain strong interests. They can wield significant power through economic and political means. And because these forces have the full backing of the Western imperialist powers, in particular the US government. The question of political power, which class it holds it, remains unsettled in Venezuela. And as class warfare rages on, violent conflict really is inevitable at some point. And that's what we're seeing manifest over the past few weeks. Right-wing violence, backed by global imperialist interests, with the true goal of overthrowing the Venezuelan government. Really, this most recent attempt has been escalating over the last year, when the imperialists identified a new opportunity to attack in the wake of Chavez's death, and the right wing intensified its efforts to undermine the Venezuelan government. It's factors within Venezuela and intervention from the US that have brought us to this point. Internally, the people of Venezuela are fighting extreme economic hardships. There are shortages of food, medicine, appliances, essentials like toilet paper. This is falsely being portrayed as an economic crisis caused by government policies, when in reality, it's an economic war waged by the Venezuelan capitalists against the people and their government. Private corporations are the major importers of these basic goods and necessities, and producers of these goods and necessities. With an intent to destabilize the country and reverse the progression of the Bolivarian process, these companies have been creating deliberate shortages of essentials and inflation. Basically, hoarding the goods and the materials to produce these goods and jacking up the prices of the limited supply that they are choosing to make available to the people. It's a tactic that actually has been used unsparingly in the past by the Venezuelan right wing, and it was renewed with vigor when the death of President Chavez last year created this new opportunity for destabilization. Over the past year, inflated costs have gone as high as 5,000%. To fight this, the government issued an economic declaration that limited profit margins to 30%. I mean, that's not a small margin, 30%.
Wow.
And really, any company that didn't abide by this limit is to be expropriated. So there's a real penalty for exploiting and profiting off the people. And it's clearly a progressive measure fighting that exploitation. The declaration was well received throughout the country, but not by the right wing. These expropriations were supposed to begin February 10th. So when you put things in context and a timeline, it becomes very obvious that the demonstrations called by the right wing for February 12th weren't timed coincidentally. There's actually a clear connection to undermine the administration's ability to govern and enforce, these measures that are put in place. So that's really how the government policy caused the economic crisis, because the capitalists began working to undermine the government's attempt to limit their ability to profit from the exploitation of the people. It's an artificial crisis in the sense that it's created intentionally to cause unrest and destabilization, and to defend the profit margin. But we also have to recognize that these artificial shortages create real hardships and grievances for the Venezuelan people. And that's a real opportunity for the right wing to use these hardships to stage a coup. So it's extremely important for us and people around the world to continue to expose the true nature of the actors and reasons behind the conflict, so that people around the world can know that the true perpetrators of hardship, violence, and unrest are not the majority in Venezuela. They are not the democratically elected Venezuelan government. They are these ultra-right-wing fascist elements defending their ability to profit, defending their wealth, defending their elite status. But it's also important for us to understand and expose the true nature of the US government's role in supporting these extreme right-wing elements. Obviously, no one here thinks the United States is acting in the interest of the poor and working people in Venezuela, or the United States when it states its positions, and really issues threats against the Venezuelan government. But the US government also has a rich history of intervening covertly and overtly, wielding economic, political, and military power to undermine or overthrow progressive movements and governments in Latin America. In 1954, the CIA overthrew the progressive government of A.N.S.W.E.R in Guatemala. In 1961, the US led a proxy invasion into Cuba and has maintained an economic blockade since then. The US government supported the fascist military government in Brazil to defeat the left. The CIA led the economic destabilization and eventual overthrow of the socialist Salvador Allende government of Chile in 1973. When the Sandinistas took power in 1979, in Nicaragua, after toppling the Somoza dictatorship, the US government launched the so-called Contra War until the Sandinistas were finally ejected from power. It was the CIA, working with the Salvadoran military, that killed tens of thousands in El Salvador. In 1983, the government invaded Grenada, and in 1989, it invaded Panama. We're given different reasons for these interventions, but the true reason is simple and far from the human rights arguments we are fed. The true reason is that the US banks and the military-industrial complex want to dominate Latin America's labor, its land, its natural resources, and any show of self-determination or progressive independency must be crushed. In this instance, the US government and the corporate media, both within Venezuela and here in the US, is portraying these right-wing protesters as the people of Venezuela fighting for freedom and democracy in the face of a cruel dictator. And this is how the protesters are attempting to portray themselves. Despite the fact that President Maduro won an election in October, and the government's party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, won 242 of 317 mayoral elections in December under these same economic conditions, we're supposed to believe that the people of Venezuela suddenly have changed their mind. That's not really what's happening. The forces leading these protests, glorified by the mainstream media and the Western imperialist governments, are those same forces who were behind the 2002 coup. They are the elite, fascist, right wing of Venezuela. They're not fighting for healthcare or education. These are recognized rights guaranteed by the Venezuelan government. They're hoarding food and medicine because a 30% profit margin is not enough. They drive Jaguars and Land Rovers and Hummers while claiming that the government is starving the people. These are not the people of Venezuela. They are organizations and individuals known to be funded by the State Department and the CIA and the NED and US aid within Venezuela and around the world. It's not a new development. US intervention has been a reliable factor throughout the Bolivarian process, and the expenditure of funds and guidance in attempts to undermine the Bolivarian revolution is really well known. The Answer Coalition, of which the PSL is a member, as Nadia had mentioned, and a coalition of organizations and individuals have been standing in solidarity in defense of the Bolivarian revolution. We have been participating in demonstrations in support of Venezuela and against the right wing, including the representatives here in the United States, across the country, from Los Angeles to Chicago, and of course here in DC. Some of you were with us 2 weeks ago when we stood outside the Venezuelan embassy in Georgetown against vicious attacks from the right wing. For 6 hours, they hurled racist, sexist, inhumane insults, telling people of color to go back to our shelters, and targeting the women in our group. Our refusal to leave or engage fueled even nastier remarks. There was not a single Afro-Venezuelan among the right wing. Not one in 6 hours. They drove up and down, honking the horns of their Land Rovers and Jaguars, posing for pictures with their 4 little Bichon Frise dogs. I loved those dogs. They were really cute. But it was a little ridiculous. I mean, there's snow and rain outside, and there were just these bright white dogs with these harnesses with the Venezuelan flag on them, and they were just kneeling down in the snow taking pictures with these dogs. And they really did, they came in waves. They took turns standing outside, so no one really had to stay outside for that long and endure the cold. I'm really elite on the streets of Georgetown couldn't comprehend why we would stand in snow and freezing rain to support the Bolivarian revolution. They levied over and over claims that we were paid to stand there. Multinational international solidarity, workers standing with workers in defense of our rights, it was just so unfathomable to them that we would be doing this. But our international solidarity, that's what won that day. We were outnumbered for most of the time, but we stood strong through snow and freezing rain, and it was really, really cold for 6 hours. And you know, really, there were all these attempts, you know, like they do want to portray themselves as these heroic people, you know, fighting for fundamental rights. It was really insulting, their attempts to hearken the true worker struggle. There was a sign out there that said, "Maduro, if you won't let us dream, we won't let you sleep." You know, like invoking the struggle here for students. That one was really rough because, you know, my dream to go to Georgetown and drive a Hummer, that's never come true too, so I really related to that side. You know, the other thing is really revealing. So, you know, the A.N.S.W.E.R Coalition and other individuals and organizations, we wrote an article about what we experienced that day, exposing the class character of the right wing. We noted their luxury cars, we noted their impeccably groomed purebred dogs, and we noted the insults that were hurled at people of color and women. And they denied that they drove fancy cars. They even denied that the dogs were present. I mean, they were, though. They were there.
We all saw them.
Yeah. But they admitted the racist, sexist insults without qualification.
Ooh.
Right, because to them, it's acceptable to degrade those that you think are below you or beneath you. I mean, that's really telling of class character in the society in which they're functioning, right? I mean, it's so clear that these people do not represent the people in Venezuela. But at the same time, we can't underestimate their significance. The scarcity and hardships in Venezuela are very real. They're instigated by the right wing, but that doesn't make them any easier for workers to bear. You know, these are grievances, and they cause, and they have the potential to turn workers against the state, and that's a really powerful tool that can undermine that government and all the progress towards socialism in that country. And imperialist powers are really just waiting to pounce. You destabilize the government, and imperialist powers are waiting to pounce on that opportunity to overthrow that government and replace it with a government that will once again open that country to plunder and cease to use the country's wealth to benefit the majority of the people, but to give private corporations 5,000% profits. You know, there's a very real potential for that here. There's a very real potential for the deterioration of the Bolivarian process and the move towards socialism. And these counter-revolutionary forces, they have the full backing of world imperialism. They're emboldened. They can wield the upper hand. And threats of intervention from the imperialist powers, of course, can impact the left's ability to fight back. That's a scary thing to be facing intervention by the U.S. But we have to remember that just because violent conflict may be inevitable, and there is a very real threat of a U.S.-backed coup, that doesn't mean that that's the way it has to be. That doesn't mean that this will deal a decisive blow to the revolution. The issue of political power needs to be settled in some way. And now is the time to support the people of Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution with international solidarity, to embolden them and give them strength in the face of this assault. Now is the time to stand up against the imperialists, the U.S. government and the CIA and the NED and USAID, who claim to act in our name and set their record straight. All people must stand against this intervention in defense of the Bolivarian Revolution, in support of the Venezuelan people's right to self-determination. We know that socialism is the only solution, the only way to eliminate the cruelties of capitalism. We are the ones who are really standing for the rights of the people. We stand with the Bolivarian Revolution, we stand with Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan government, and we stand with the people of Venezuela.